Picture the produce aisle. Fresh broccoli, a few dollars a bag, and 2 rows over, the same broccoli frozen, cheaper, and it keeps for months instead of days. For years, the quiet assumption has been that only one of those is the real choice, if you actually care about your blood sugar after 60, and it's not the one in the freezer. Here's where that assumption gets it backwards. A handful of specific frozen foods are frozen close enough to the moment they were picked that they lock in nutrients fresh produce keeps quietly losing every day it spends, in a truck, on a shelf, and then in your own fridge. This isn't an argument to give up fresh food, and it isn't asking you to overhaul your freezer. It's 7 specific frozen foods worth knowing by name, 1 label habit that tells you which bags are secretly working against you, and 1 item at the very end that ties the whole list together. Let's start with the one most people already own and mostly ignore. Number 7. Frozen spinach. The bag sits in the door of your freezer, half-used, frost building on the inside of the plastic, while a fresh bunch from last week is turning to soup at the bottom of your crisper drawer. That's not a failure on your part. Fresh spinach can lose as much as 90% of its vitamin C within the first 48 hours after it's picked. By the time a bunch has traveled from a farm to a truck to a store shelf to your kitchen, a meaningful share of what made it worth buying is already gone before you've cooked a single leaf. Frozen spinach skips almost all of that clock. Commercial freezing blanches and freezes it within hours of picking, close to its nutritional peak, which is part of why comparative nutrient studies keep finding frozen produce equal to, and sometimes ahead of, fresh produce that sat around for a few days. That same blanching step does something else too. If you've heard that spinach is loaded with oxalates, the compound tied to kidney stones in people prone to them, that quick hot water step before freezing pulls out a measurable share of it, anywhere from about 15 to 50%, depending on the method. A bag of frozen spinach starts out gentler on that front than the raw leaf ever does. Magnesium and iron ride along either way. 2 minerals a lot of adults over 60 run short on without realizing it, since the usual sign, feeling more tired than the day's activity explains, gets written off as just getting older. Magnesium, in particular, is quietly involved in how efficiently your body's cells respond to insulin in the first place, not just how strong your muscles feel. A body running low on it has to work harder to get the same result from the same meal. Here's the one habit to build at the freezer case. Plain frozen spinach, nothing else listed, is the version doing this work. The kind pre-mixed with a cream sauce packet is a different food, with sodium and starch riding along that plain spinach never had. Thaw it in a colander, squeeze out the water, and it folds into scrambled eggs, a pot of soup, or a hot pan with garlic and olive oil in under 10 minutes. No wilting on the counter, no rinsing sandy leaves twice, no tossing the third of the bunch you didn't get to in time. Spinach alone won't tell you much about protein though, which is exactly where the next food in this freezer takes over. Number 6. Frozen edamame. Here's a detail that doesn't quite add up at first. A cup of shelled edamame, straight out of a bag that's been sitting in your freezer for months, carries close to 18 grams of protein. That's more than most people get from their entire breakfast, from a food most shopping lists don't even mention. Edamame is simply young soybeans, picked and frozen while they're still green and tender, and the protein is only part of what it's doing. It also carries a meaningful amount of fiber and magnesium in that same small serving, and that combination is what matters for blood sugar specifically. Fiber slows how fast the carbohydrate in a meal reaches your bloodstream. Magnesium plays a direct role in how efficiently insulin can do its job at the cellular level. Edamame's own glycemic index sits low, generally somewhere in the 12 to 20 range, meaning it barely moves your blood sugar on its own, while still helping the rest of the plate. If you've heard that soy affects hormones and steered clear of it for that reason, that concern traces back mostly to studies using far higher soy doses than anyone eating a normal portion of edamame ever gets close to. That worry has outlived the evidence that ever supported it. Here's what makes the frozen version the one to keep stocked. There's no shelling from raw, no blanching a fresh pod yourself, and no window where it goes bad on the counter before you get to it. Steam the pods for about 5 minutes and add a light sprinkle of salt, and it's about as low effort as a side dish gets. Or shell it straight into a stir-fry, a grain bowl, or a green salad for a protein boost that needs no cooking at all. A bag also keeps for months without any part of it going to waste, which is worth something on its own if you've ever bought a carton of fresh shelled peas or beans, used half, and found the rest gone soft in the fridge by the weekend. Cooked and cooled, leftover edamame holds up fine tossed cold into a salad the next day. Unlike most cooked vegetables that turn watery and sad after a night in the fridge. But 18 grams of protein only helps if the rest of the plate isn't working against it. And that's exactly where a lot of plates go wrong. Number 5. Frozen cauliflower rice. A cup of cooked white rice carries about 45 grams of carbohydrate. A cup of cauliflower rice carries about 5. That's roughly a 90% difference, in a dish that looks and cooks almost exactly the same way. The reason comes down to what each food actually is. White rice is a grain, mostly starch, with a glycemic index around 73, high enough to move your blood sugar quickly and noticeably. Cauliflower rice is a vegetable, riced small enough to act like a grain in a bowl, and its glycemic index sits closer to 15, low enough that it barely registers the same way. This isn't a claim that rice is forbidden, or that you need to give it up for good. It's simply an option for the nights the plate needs less starch than usual, without changing the shape of the meal sitting on it. The frozen version is the one to keep around, for a specific reason. A whole head of cauliflower, riced fresh, means pulling out a food processor, dealing with the smell, and using up a vegetable that goes soft in the crisper drawer within a few days, if you don't get through the whole head. The frozen bag skips every part of that. It sautés in a dry pan or a splash of olive oil in under 5 minutes, straight from frozen, no thawing required. There's also a plain cost argument here that's easy to miss. A whole head of cauliflower, riced at home, often works out more expensive per usable cup than a bag of the pre-riced frozen version once you count what gets trimmed away and thrown out, especially for a household of 1 or 2 where a whole head rarely gets finished before it turns. Season it the way you'd season rice: garlic and butter, a squeeze of lime, or fold it into whatever you were already cooking that usually sits on top of rice. Most people can't tell the difference in a stir-fry or a bowl once it's under a sauce or alongside other food. But a lighter starch on the plate still needs something to slow down what's left of it, and that's not a job cauliflower rice can do alone. The one label habit that covers all 7. You don't need 7 separate rules to get this right. The label check is the same one every time, as close to plain as the bag gets. Nothing sauced, nothing sweetened, nothing breaded. If a bag lists more than the food itself, and maybe salt, that's usually the version working against you instead of for you. Number 4. Frozen shrimp. Buy it fresh from the fish counter, not the freezer bag. You've probably heard some version of that advice for as long as you've been buying seafood. Here's what it usually gets wrong. Unless you live within a short drive of a working dock, the shrimp sitting on ice at your grocery store's fish counter was almost certainly frozen shortly after it was caught, then thawed for display before you ever saw it. The bag in the freezer case a few steps away is often the exact same shrimp at an earlier point in that same timeline, before the thaw and refreeze cycle the counter version has already been through. Nutritionally, a 3-ounce serving carries about 20 grams of protein and under 1 gram of carbohydrate, whether it came from the counter or the bag. For a meal, that's a meaningful amount of protein doing actual work, taking the edge off however much carbohydrate ends up next to it, while adding almost nothing of its own to worry about. Here's the part that matters most for someone managing this on their own. Shrimp from the fish counter has a short window before it needs to be cooked, which usually means a trip to the store built around a specific dinner that night. The frozen bag has no such deadline. Pull out exactly what you need, a handful or a full pound, and the rest waits with no clock running and nothing wasted. Thaw it in a bowl of cold water for about 10 minutes if you're in a hurry, or cook it straight from frozen in a hot pan for a minute longer than usual. A squeeze of lemon, garlic, and olive oil is most of what it needs. One thing worth checking on the bag: some frozen shrimp is treated with a sodium solution to help it hold moisture. It's not a deal breaker, just worth a glance at the label if you're also watching your sodium for blood pressure. There's also a smaller, everyday benefit here that's easy to overlook. Fresh fish and shellfish carry a short, honest smell that tells you when they've turned, which is useful, but it also means a piece bought a day too early gets thrown out rather than risked. A frozen bag removes that guessing game entirely. What's sealed in the freezer today is exactly as good in 3 weeks as it is tonight, with nothing to sniff and no gamble to make before you cook it. Shrimp solves protein in about 10 minutes flat. What comes next solves a problem people usually give up on for the wrong reason. Number 3. Frozen okra. Here's the honest reason okra doesn't make most people's list: the texture. Sliced fresh and cooked wrong, it turns slick and stringy, and that one bad experience is usually enough to write it off for good. That reputation is about preparation, not the food itself, and it deserves a second look before this list goes any further. None of these 7 foods are much use if the one backed by the most direct clinical evidence gets skipped over a texture memory from years ago. A review pooling 8 separate clinical trials found that okra, in a concentrated form, improved fasting blood sugar and a longer-term blood sugar marker in people with type 2 diabetes. The mechanism is its fiber and a natural gel-like compound called mucilage, which slows digestion the same way other soluble fiber does. Most of those trials, though, used a concentrated dried okra powder at a measured daily amount, not a cup of cooked pods, so the exact numbers in that review shouldn't be promised from a normal serving. The fiber and mucilage mechanism itself is well established, and it's doing genuine work in any form you eat it. This is where frozen genuinely fixes the texture problem, not just the convenience problem. Frozen okra comes pre-sliced, so the slimy cutting step, the part most people find off-putting, never happens in your kitchen at all. Roasted from frozen at a high heat, or stewed with tomatoes, garlic, and onion, the texture most people remember disappears, replaced by something closer to a firm, slightly tangy vegetable. 15 minutes in a hot oven, tossed in olive oil and salt, is most of what it needs. Or into a simmering pot of tomatoes for a side that needs almost no attention. If okra has always been a regular part of your cooking, rather than a food you're just now trying, the frozen bag is still worth the swap. It solves the exact same fresh spoils fast, has to be prepped same-day problem as everything else on this list, without asking you to change a recipe you've already trusted for years. Okra earns its spot on evidence alone. The next one earns it on timing. Number 2. Frozen green beans. They go limp and spotted in the fridge before I finish the bag. That's the most common reason people give for buying fresh green beans less and less. Not the taste, not the price, just the timing. Green beans lose vitamin C faster than almost any other vegetable in storage, as much as 77% within a week in the refrigerator. That's the steepest drop of any vegetable measured in that research, which means the exact vegetable most likely to go to waste in your crisper drawer is also the one losing the most nutritionally while it sits there. Cauliflower and spinach both told a version of this story earlier in this list. Green beans just lose it the fastest. The frozen version carries a glycemic index around 30, solidly low, and about 3 to 4 grams of fiber in a cup, and neither number moves once the bag goes in the freezer. Steamed, sautéed, or straight from a steam-in-bag package with a few minutes in the microwave, It's one of the simplest sides on this entire list to get right. And it keeps for months. With none of the spotting or softening, a fresh bag develops within days. The one bag to walk past is the casserole-style mix, the one already sitting in a cream sauce with fried onions on top. That's a different dish entirely, closer to a side of gravy than a vegetable, with a carbohydrate and sodium count nowhere near the plain bag. Plain, whole, or cut green beans, nothing else on the ingredient list, is the version doing the actual work here. This is also one of the easier foods to season without adding much starch or sugar. A little olive oil and cracked pepper, sliced almonds for crunch, a squeeze of lemon at the end. All of it takes the plain vegetable from forgettable to something worth finishing the whole bag of, which is the actual goal here, not just buying it. One food's left. It's the big one. Number 1. Frozen mixed berries. Fresh berries sold out of season, flown in during winter so the shelf never looks empty, are picked before they're fully ripe so they can survive days of shipping without turning to mush. Frozen berries are picked and flash frozen within hours, at the moment they're actually ready, which is also the moment their natural sugar-to-fiber balance and their antioxidant content are at their highest. That's the whole assumption from the start of this video. In one food. The bag in the freezer isn't the backup plan. For a fruit like this, it's very often the more complete one. The research on what those antioxidants, called anthocyanins, do for blood sugar is genuinely mixed. A meta-analysis pooling multiple randomized trials found that blueberry and cranberry intake lowered fasting blood sugar and a longer-term blood sugar marker in people with type 2 diabetes, with the clearest effect at higher amounts sustained for 2 months or more. A separate 6-month trial in people with metabolic syndrome found no measurable improvement in insulin sensitivity specifically, even though other heart-related markers did improve. Put together, berries appear to help meaningfully on some measures and not reliably on others. They're not a fix on their own. What isn't in question is the practical case. A bag of frozen mixed berries carries real fiber alongside its natural sugar, part of why whole berries behave differently in your body than fruit juice or a bowl of white sugar ever will. Unlike fresh berries, which mold within days, no matter how carefully you store them, the frozen bag waits in your freezer exactly as long as you need it to. That single fact solves an actual, specific problem for a lot of people watching this. A pint of fresh raspberries or blackberries, priced for a family of 4, often goes moldy before one person living alone gets through half of it, which quietly turns a healthy purchase into wasted money more often than anyone likes to admit. A bag that portions out exactly what you need, whenever you need it, doesn't have that problem at all. A small spoonful stirred into plain yogurt, into oatmeal, or blended into a smoothie with a scoop of the frozen spinach from earlier on this list, moves you towards something with real staying power, not a bowl of straight sugar dressed up as a healthy choice. Check the bag for one thing before you buy it. Plain, unsweetened, no added syrup. Some brands add a sugar coating you don't need and won't taste, and it defeats the entire point of choosing this food in the first place. Most of what's in your freezer right now was already pulling its weight. You just hadn't been giving it credit. One thing worth checking first. Spinach, along with other leafy greens, is one of the main dietary sources of vitamin K. If you're on warfarin or another blood thinner where your doctor watches vitamin K specifically, the standard guidance isn't to avoid greens. It's to keep your intake roughly consistent from week to week, since a big swing up or down is what actually throws off the medication, not a steady amount. That means the fix here isn't cutting spinach out. It's picking roughly how much you're going to eat in a normal week and sticking close to that amount, rather than skipping it for 2 weeks and then having a large batch of it 3 days in a row. If that applies to you, mention any real change in how much frozen spinach or other greens you're eating to your doctor or your anticoagulation clinic, so they can watch for it and adjust if they need to. For everyone else, none of this changes anything about how you eat. The one thing to actually do. You don't need all 7 of these in your freezer by tomorrow. Pick one. The next time you're at the store and the fresh version of something on this list is looking a little tired or a little more expensive than you remembered, buy the frozen bag instead and let it sit in your freezer until you actually need it. That's the whole plan. One swap, made the next time it comes up naturally, not 7 changes forced into this week's shopping trip. Out of everything on this list, which one turned out to already be in your freezer further back than you'd realized? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. A simple grocery list built around these 7 foods for steadier blood sugar after 60, along with portion amounts that make sense for you, is sitting in the free action guide, and you'll find it linked below this video or pinned in the comments. If keeping a video like this one showing up in your feed without having to go looking for it sounds useful, that's what subscribing does. Next time, we're getting into what actually happens the moment a frozen meal and a hot one land in your stomach, and why the temperature on your plate might matter more than you'd think.